that gives students money. And it's very frustrating for me to read some of the applications, because some of the applications tell exactly what the student is doing in great detail, but we have 50 applications, and the 5 people on the committee giving out the money are 5 different fields of science or engineering. Okay? Let me give you an example. I'm an astronomer. I happen to study stars, what stars are made of. If I ask for a scholarship or a fellowship award, the committee has one person who studies Mars, one person who studies stars, one person who studies galaxies, one who studies dark matter, and one who studies the origin of the universe. 4 of the 5 of them are not interested in stars. Okay? Now it turns out, as I'll mention in passing in a minute, the stars I study are the oldest known stars in the universe. That means they go back to just a short time after the Big Bang began our whole universe. So if somebody is interested in cosmology, the Big Bang, how the universe started, my stars can tell them a lot about the cosmology. But unless I explain that, and that's what I call the broader impact or the broader implication, if I don't explain that in my application, some other student gets the money. I don't. Okay? I even had a student of my own who wrote a detailed application. I guess she worked on it for several days before showing it to me. And she did wonderful work, but her application could only be understood by probably 20 people in the world. And I knew none of them were going to be on the committee giving the money. So I asked her to explain things much more broadly, and she did, and she got a very big scholarship. But she didn't think about that, or maybe I hadn't given her that advice in enough time, and it was a very close call. Here's another thing. Somewhere, if it hasn't happened already, I'm sure it's happened already, you may look around you and you may look at some of the other students and you may get discouraged. And you may say, I'm not like that person. I wonder if I can succeed because that person seems very good. And what I want to point out to you is people learn in very different ways. And you know, you've probably sat in classes with people who sit in the front and answer all the questions very quickly. It would be wrong to conclude that those are going to be the most successful students. People solve problems in very different ways. Let me give you an example. My last 2 PhD students happened to be at the University of Chicago before I moved to Colorado. And Francesca, who came to me on a fellowship from Italy, she was a couple of years older than Louisa, who was a newer student. If I gave both of them a question to answer, maybe one that required a little bit of computing, Louisa goes away, she would come back to me in 1 hour with 10 printouts. She's run 10 different scenarios on the computer within 1 or 2 hours. And she puts all 10 on my desk and says the answer's in there someplace. Okay? Francesca would go away for the entire day. She would come back and she would have 1 printout and she would set it down and she would say, I think this is what the answer is. Now, interestingly enough, both of them went on, earned their PhDs, and both have very good scientific positions. So, as Louisa got more experienced, instead of running 10 models or 100 models, she would think about it more and run a smaller number of cases. However, she's now on the scientific staff of a big NASA telescope that gathers almost a terabyte of data, and her ability to process a lot of things is actually valuable. But they could hardly be more different in how they solve the problems. So just because you see somebody different from you, you should not conclude there's something wrong with you necessarily. And that's why it's so powerful to work in groups with people. So, whether you work with somebody else when you solve homework, when you work on projects or problems, may mostly depend on your personality, your culture. But what I'm here to tell you is, at least in the United States, studies of students that collaborate find they have a higher percentage of success. They do better. So you can actually learn from that person who's sitting next to you, whether you really like to do that or not. Now, again, this is a little culturally specific. I'm most familiar with the United States, but it's especially... No, that's not true, okay? I'm familiar with the scientific work in my field in probably 6 or 8 countries in detail. And in every one of those countries, it's extra important for women to speak up and to speak with confidence. Let me try a little experiment that I've never done before, and we'll see how it works, okay? I'd like you to think of a scientist or engineer in your field that you think is very good. Okay? I'll give you, 10 seconds. Think of somebody that you've maybe been taught by that you think is very good. Okay? Got that person in mind? Let's find out. Please choose A if the person you're remembering is male, and B if that person is female that you were just thinking of. I'll only give you 5 seconds because this shouldn't require a lot of thought. 2 seconds? Okay, we have a couple of people abstaining. Let's see. I never tried this experiment before. I think this is rather interesting. Okay, so 94% thought of a man. Now let's just vote. This should only take you a couple of seconds. A if you are male, and B if you are female. So that is interesting, okay? This is just something for you to be aware of, especially when you're collaborating as a student, or to be perfectly honest, after you're a student, okay? If you're working in a group, let's say a group of 3, if 2 are male and 1 is female, bad for her. Because we know from studies of group work, she is not going to be heard. Okay? You can look at videos, and there's 2 guys and 1 girl solving a scientific problem. And the girl says, oh, I think the answer is blah, blah, blah. And they ignore her. And then 1 minute later, one of the guys says, I think the answer is blah, blah, blah. And the other guy says, yeah, that's right. Okay, and then she agrees. Anyway, the point is to be aware that successful communication has to be effective. And that means it has to reach the audience. And sometimes that audience is 2 other people you're working with, and sometimes it's the people reading the paper you publish, and sometimes it's the committee that's giving away money. So think of who you're trying to reach, and then make sure you do it effectively. I just thought I'd mention this one experiment. I find it pretty amazing. I'll let you read what happened in this experiment, and I'll collect your response. Just to reiterate, the sample size was quite large, hundreds of estimates. So what do you think happened? A, B, C, or D? On this, I'd like your personal opinion. Five more seconds. 2 more seconds. Okay, now everyone's participating. Excellent. And you're pretty well this time, because that's the correct answer, B. So, again, it's just a reminder. Communicating with people and making personal judgments is actually usually harder than math and physics. Okay? And nobody oh, by the way, in this experiment, it didn't matter whether the people doing the judging were male or female. They had a subconscious expectation which filtered their observations. So when you eventually not only have a job, but get to the point where you're hiring people, remember this kind of thing goes on. You didn't go into the field you're in to study psychology, but you can't escape it entirely. Some other good ideas. Get a mentor. Find a faculty member that you can go to informally and say, I need some advice. I'm curious. Ask them about their career. You might be very surprised. When I was a graduate student, I was in a department with some very famous scientists, and I was sure they were born in the department. You know, I just thought they spent their whole career there, and when I got a little bit older and got to talk to them informally, most of them had jobs at not such good universities, and they moved because of the opportunity. And I never knew that. You've already talked about CVs. What I did when I had to write my first CV was I asked several successful people for copies of theirs. And then I chose the format that I thought looked good. When you're applying for a job, of course, you want to put yourself in the place of the other person who's interviewing you. Ask yourself, why would they be interested in me? And you know, I mean, don't stress out about this too much, but think about the different things that you have to offer and be prepared, you know, to answer that. We were talking informally before things started tonight, and this gentleman made the claim that the knowledge in biology has a half-life of about 3 years. I don't know exactly what it is in physics or in astrophysics, but it certainly changes pretty fast. And so, you need to be more broad and more flexible than to just say, I can do one thing really well, hire me. You ought to give the impression that you have the desire to learn new things as well. Recommendation D. Anybody heard of Eric Kandel? Any chance? Okay, he actually was a biologist who won the Nobel Prize. He's about 85 years old, and he developed some of the first understanding of how neurons respond and store memory. And this is his autobiography. The reason I recommend it to you is it's the only honest autobiography of a famous scientist I ever read. Okay? All the rest of them, if you read them, the person comes across as really glorious. In his autobiography, he says that when he got hired for his first job, he was just deathly afraid that he couldn't do anything. And he honestly says all the things he couldn't do. And he was a postdoc in doing medical research, and he found another postdoc whose lacks of knowledge complemented his. So he wanted to measure neurons, but he wasn't any good at electricity. So he found another person who was good at electricity, who was sort of weak on the scientific understanding of the neurons, and they collaborated. So I think you might find it pretty inspiring to read that. The other thing which I think is pretty impressive is he was Austrian, and he's pretty old. He was on the faculty just before World War II in Austria. And the bad thing for him is he was Jewish. And so when the Nazis started to come to power, they had a discussion in the faculty meeting, what should we do with the half of our faculty that are Jewish? And what they decided was they should fire them all and hire new people. Okay, and so his family had to leave Austria because of that. 50 years later, when he won the Nobel Prize, he got a call from the Chancellor of Austria saying, "I'm so happy it's the first Nobel Prize in medicine for an Austrian." And he said to the Chancellor of Austria, "You're 50 years too late. I'm an American," and hung up. So I was pretty impressed with that. So like I said, be flexible and open to new opportunities. That happened to me. My postdoctoral work involved finding sunspot cycles on other stars. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know, our sun has a cycle of 11 years called the Sunspot Cycle. And every 11 years, the sun gets a lot of spots on the surface, and when it does, it has a lot of eruptions called solar flares that blow particles through space. Some of that hits the Earth and it makes the northern lights. It can knock out satellites. And the research work I first did found sunspot cycles on other stars. If you're curious about the details, you can ask me over dinner, okay? The point was, it was a pretty interesting discovery, and it got a lot of response in the scientific community. But then I had a chance to join the staff of the Hubble Space Telescope. And if I did that, I was to be responsible for a spectrograph that worked in the ultraviolet. And I really wanted to work with the Hubble telescope, and so I decided, well, geez, if I have an instrument that looks in the ultraviolet, I better change my research to use the ultraviolet. And I did, and that's why I started studying very old stars. You can consider them fossil stars that go back to nearly the Big Bang. So I had an opportunity to change, and it was good. It's always scary when you change, because there's one thing that you know. But take the opportunities. I actually had a third change, and when I was at the University of Chicago, I had a chance to become a commentator on what Americans call National Public Radio, like the BBC. And that was a little bit scary, because I knew that there were hundreds of thousands of people listening to me, but I couldn't see them. It's just a microphone, so it wasn't too bad. So be flexible. Even Nobel Prize winners can change what they work on. My university is pretty famous right now because Carl Wyman, who won the Nobel Prize about 6 years ago for the first time making a Bose-Einstein condensate, he came back to the university, and to a lot of people's surprise, he announced he was completely changing his personal research. Now, I guess it's fair to say that if you win a Nobel Prize, you can change your research more easily than if you don't, right? But anyway, he changed his research to entirely focus on improving the teaching of physics, which is pretty amazing. Now, I don't want to use the clickers for this, but would anybody in the room like an academic career, possibly as a professor? Okay, so what I'm about to say now goes especially for you, but the rest of you can probably enjoy it too. If you end up teaching as a professor, or in any other context, you should know that there is a major change going on in how people teach science. And it's based on research understanding how people learn. It turns out that even though all of us like to have professors who are clear and, enthusiastic and motivating, it's not the professor that does the learning in the class. It's you. It's the students. And so even what professors are trying to do is changing. How can someone who's teaching, say, a large class, even a moderately large class, even a small class, how can you get all the students in the class to be active mentally in learning? That's a real challenge. It's been a challenge for a while, right? Look at this room you're in. It looks exactly like the room in Greece. where a Greek orator would have spoken to students. It's a little bit softer here, but it's the same thing, right? And it's an interesting question. Oh, where did that go? Yeah, interesting question. How effective is this? You know, we just keep doing it year after year. Well, let me give you an interesting example. Carl Wyman, in addition to being a Nobel Prize winner, or perhaps despite that, is a very good teacher. He's clear, and he's very interesting, and he teaches a physics class, or he taught a physics class, for people who are not physics majors. You may know in American universities, no matter what your major is, you're supposed to take a little bit of everything. A little bit of science if you're going to be a writer, and a little bit of literature if you're going to be a scientist. That's how Americans do it. So anyway, there's this big class called Physics of Everyday Life. How do things work? And one of the things he explains is, how does a violin work? Now, you don't have to read all this. I'll summarize what it says. He says that yes, a violin has strings, and when you play the violin, the strings vibrate, but that doesn't move very much air. So a violin has a wooden body, and the body of the violin vibrates. I don't know how well you know violins, but they have these two little F-shaped holes, and the wood vibrates, it moves air, and especially in a big room, what you hear when someone's playing a violin is actually the air moved by the wood of the body of the violin, not the strings. So he explains that. He holds up a violin, he points to it. 15 minutes later, in the same lecture, he asked his students, when you hear a violin, is the sound mostly produced by the strings, the wood vibrating, both equally, or none of the above? My question for you right now is, what percentage of his students gave the correct answer? Okay? Can you see this in the very back? Okay, so if you're a pessimist, you might choose A, which is no one. B is 10%, C is 30%, D is 70%, and E is 90%. Now remember, 15 minutes later, in the same lecture, when he taught this. Okay, 5 seconds to give me your opinion. 2 seconds. 1 second. I think there are 40 of us. 1 abstention. Okay. Well, it turns out that the correct answer is 10%. Okay, now let me be honest with you. I chose an especially difficult question. Why is it difficult? Because most people, probably when they're about 6 years old or 7 years old or younger, they see a violin and somebody says to, and they wonder how it works, and they see the strings and they decide, oh, the strings are vibrating. And what I'm saying is, if there's something that you've had in your mind for 10 years, and someone says to you, oh no, that's not right, this theory is right, it is very, very hard to push out of your mind the wrong idea that you've had for 10 years. And I guarantee you, throughout your career, when you talk to people and you have a different idea than they do about what's the right answer, it's hard to convince them. And that's one of the reasons. Okay? Now, again, I chose a difficult example. It's easier if you know nothing. A lot of professors incorrectly assume that if they're teaching a first class, the students don't know anything. Not true. If you're 18, 20 years old, you know a lot of things. They may be some of them wrong, but they're in there. Okay? If Aristotle was wrong, he was smart. He's not a dumb person. If he got it wrong, a lot of scientists and engineering students get it wrong too. Not everything is intuitive. If you're curious how I know all this, most professors would say that the most detailed way to know what a student is thinking is to invite them to your office and give them an oral exam, right? Or talk to them for 15 minutes and find out just what they know. Now, thank goodness, or I would have died as a student, they don't give you oral exams in every class. And you can't give oral exams to thousands of people. But what we've done is we've interviewed hundreds of students, and it turns out that mistakes that are made in physics, and this is just starting in engineering, the mistakes tend to repeat year after year. So we now know, 50 or 100 misconceptions that many students have. Now, the nasty thing we do is to make a multiple choice test where every wrong answer is believed by many, many students. So to get this multiple choice test correct, you have to really be sure of understanding the concepts. And what we learn from this is this. Of all the things your professors teach you during a semester, if what you do is go to lecture and listen and take notes, and that's mostly what you do, you're going to learn about 25%. Now, by learn, I mean learn thoroughly. So this axis here is the fraction of everything taught during the semester that you didn't know on the first day that you would know by the last day. So the maximum is about 30%. If what you do is listen and just take notes. So it turns out that what a lot of people think teaching is wrong. It is not just the transfer of new information into somebody's empty brain. It's not really how learning works. Just telling about a subject is surprisingly ineffective. To make an idea useful to you, you've got to not only learn it, but you have to connect it to all the other things that you know. And that's what takes the work. So that means you learn about it in lecture, but then you have to think about it. You've got to explain it to another student. You've got to use it on homework. You've got to use it in a project. Only when you use it does it really become yours. Okay? So is there anything that professors can do to help you with this? Well, yeah. They can assign you projects. You learn a lot from projects. They can encourage you to talk to the other students. And you probably notice good students after class, as soon as the professor leaves, one says to the other, "What do you mean by that?" Or in the future, "What does she mean by that?" Okay? Now, the effective use of these clickers is to force you to have that conversation, whether you like it or not. Let me give you an example, okay? At the University of Colorado, there are 17,000 of these in use. And on the average, students are scoring maybe 20% higher than they did 5 years ago. Actually, I have the data. I'll show you the data. Okay? So in this way of teaching, every time I introduce a new concept, I ask you a question and ask you to explain to your neighbor what you think the answer is. So let me give you an example of that. Now I know the summer school that you're studying, and I'm guessing that you know a lot about physics and engineering, and so I brought one biology question for you. Okay, so you might have an advantage. But it's a question that you probably learned about in elementary school. How many of you studied the subject of photosynthesis? You know what I mean by that? Photosynthesis is how a plant works. So let me see that again. How many people studied photosynthesis? And how old were you when you studied it? Do you remember? I'll take your contribution. What do you think? Really? 15? How old? 14? Okay. In our school, it's probably more like 12, which is your advantage. Okay. All right, so I have a question for you about photosynthesis. I would like you to answer the question individually first, but then I'm going to give you a chance to consult with your neighbors. So here's the question. This is what's called an acorn in English. It's the seed from which you grow an oak tree. So if you put this in the ground and it gets watered and you wait many years, you get a tree like this. If you wait more years, the tree falls down, somebody cuts it into logs, and you have these old logs, and one of these old logs has maybe 10 to the 4th times as much mass as the seed from which it grew. My question is, where did all that mass come from? Where did most of the mass that's in a log come from? Please don't talk to anyone else. You just give an answer A, B, C, D, or E. My little receiver here that collects all your data, puts it in my laptop, tells me what you're saying real time. I can see what you're saying. Okay, looks like, oh, look at that. Everybody is clicked in. And let's see what you say. Wow! A flat distribution in the statistical uncertainties there. Impressive. Okay, so think about what we've done so far. Because of this very inexpensive device, I know what everyone in this room is thinking. That's incredibly powerful. It is very different than if I asked you to raise your hands. Okay? If I ever was so stupid as to say, does anyone have any questions? I know what you'll do. You'll all look around and think, oh my, I'm the only one. No way. You don't have to do that anymore because this is anonymous to your neighbors. I forgot to tell you, it's not anonymous to me. Everyone has a serial number. Okay? And it puts it into Excel spreadsheet for me. So I can look and I can see who needs help, who doesn't need help, and so forth. Okay? Now, I know that at least 70% of you are wrong. So the first thing I might think to do is to give another example and reteach my lesson on photosynthesis. That wouldn't be bad. It would be better than going on. But it turns out our research shows something very fascinating. If I don't tell you the answer, but I give you 2 minutes to consult with your neighbors, it's very likely you're going to figure out the correct answer. Okay, so I'm going to do that right now. I'll give you 2 minutes, talk to the people who are near you, and you decide which is the right answer. Okay? When you're ready, you can give me an answer, okay? Sorry? Okay, 4 more people, 2 people, 1. Everyone. Excellent. Oh, no, that's not someone who voted twice. If you change your vote, it's just the last one that's recorded. Okay? So, I didn't say anything, and 60% of you have all moved to answer E. Isn't that interesting? Especially because you're correct. Okay? Now, my goal here was not to teach you photosynthesis. My goal was to expose you to a different way of teaching a lecture class. And it turns out that if you had an exam to take, say 2 weeks from now, if you figured it out yourself, you're going to score higher on the exam than if I told you. Okay? Just the same way that some project you get assigned to do, you're going to remember 20 years from now. All the things that went wrong and the things that went right. What's the result of doing this? We've been doing this for almost 10 years at my university, at our university. This is one of the best lecturers in the physics department. He gets right up there at 25% deep learning. Then we introduced the clickers. And for the people who use them consistently and ask conceptual questions like I just did, the learning increases a lot. If you also give exercises for students to work on in groups that are based on the misconceptions that we know are there in physics, you do amazingly well. But these misconceptions have only been researched in physics. I'm in astronomy, so it doesn't benefit me. But I can use the clickers. This kind of research is now going on in biology, starting in engineering, starting in geology, and some other fields. So, when you get the opportunity to teach, there's something called the golden rule. Don't do it. Okay? Base your teaching on methods that have scientific data behind them, not just the opinion of the professor down the hall. Okay? Or just what worked for you. Let me end with one little story. When you gave the answer to that question, where I didn't say anything, what was I doing? Mostly, I was listening to you. I was walking around and I was hearing your arguments. And that is really valuable if you're trying to teach. Because you should not assume that the students are all making the assumptions that you think they're making. And that's why Carl Lyman, who's a Nobel Prize winner, gave all of the people who do this kind of research with him a children's book. He gave me the book called Fish is Fish. And it's about 2 little, well, you think they're fish, and they're living in a pond, but one of them is actually a tadpole. He's going to turn into a frog. And the fish have always wondered what's out there on the land. They know there's something there, but they couldn't go there. And then when this one turns into a frog, he can go on the land. And so he promises his friend he'll go up to the land, he'll see what's there, and he'll come back and tell him. And he does. He comes back and says there are amazing creatures called birds. They have wings and feathers, and they fly through the air. That's what he says to his friend. And so, you know, he's a very good teacher, and so the fish knows exactly what a bird is like. Right? It has feathers and wings, and it flies through the air. He didn't say that it looked like a fish, but the personal experience of the fish was combined with the new knowledge. Then he says there's even things called cows. They have udders, they eat grass. and so his friend imagines that. Okay? Every time we teach a scientific concept, students take it, put it in their minds with their own assumptions. And if you're teaching, it's just enormously valuable to know what those assumptions are, and that's why I was listening to you and occasionally giving some suggestions. Okay? So this is a very new, it's a very different way of teaching. It so happens that I'm the author of the only book so far designed for professors to give them a few hints on how to teach this interactive way. I told you that Carl Wyman has dedicated a major research group, actually 2 research groups, more than 5 million euros being invested in studying how people learn physics. And he has a lot of really useful tips and papers, and if you Google either this or this, you're going to come up with all those papers. And I'll give you this PowerPoint. You can put it up, and if you click on my personal links here, you'll come to some of the same stuff. So I think, yeah, that's the end. I had one extra clicker question, but I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I'm happy maybe to talk just a couple of short questions here and then anything else informally over dinner. And that'll give us time to recollect the clickers. Okay? I've been in one physics class in China. And the class I was in, the professor never left the board and didn't do this kind of interactive, activity. Now, that's okay if you're a really, really good student. You take notes, and when the professor is done, then you have all this discussion on your own. But I would be very interested, especially from anyone who's not from the United States, if you think this approach would be interesting to try where you come from. I would be fascinated to hear that. I know it's just your opinion, so I'm not going to hold it to you, but whether you think it would work culturally or not, I'd be interested in that. But I'll answer your questions now. And if somebody has the bag, we'll pass it around while we're talking. Yeah. Question?
Yeah, you have to on all the
So his question was, if you wanted to teach this way, do you have to alter your curriculum significantly? Answer is yes. Another question that often comes up is, if you take time to give these responses, don't you cover less material? Answer is yes. I probably cover 20% less than I did before this. But in the old way, the students were only learning 25% of all I taught. And when I found that out, I got really irritated that I was wasting some of my time. So I'm completely convinced, since my students' grades have gone up, that the amount they learn is higher. So did it take some work? Yes. It's very good to cooperate with other professors. If I come up with 10 good questions and someone else has 10 more, we share them. That helps.
very often students learn 20% more.
Ah.
You cancel.
So, yeah, that's a very